Hi guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan. Welcome back to my channel. Sorry it's been a while since I have posted, but there's been a lot of things changing in life. I haven't had a lot of time to post recently. Now, if you're interested in some of my training content, I've actually started being a full-time trainer earlier this year over at CBT Nuggets. You might have found out about this if you follow me on Twitter. You can follow me over on Twitter at PCGeek86, and I tweet about a variety of different technology-related topics like Microsoft and AWS and PowerShell and Python and a whole bunch of other things, so please check that out. Additionally, you can follow me directly, censorship-free, on trevorsullivan.net, where I periodically will publish new kind of tips and tricks articles about things that I come across, little problems and solutions, or maybe completely new solutions to problems that I solved on my own with some research, of course. So what I wanted to do in this video is to address a topic that I came across on a Reddit thread about PowerShell, where somebody was asking how you could run multiple versions of PowerShell side by side. So if you're familiar with PowerShell Core, the cross-platform version of PowerShell, you probably know that it is updated on a fairly regular basis. So we had PowerShell version 6.0 originally that came out several years ago, I believe. It was open sourced back in 2016. I think it was October 2016 or maybe August of 2016. I can't exactly remember. It's been a few years, which is definitely a good thing. But we've gone through a number of iterations of minor versions of PowerShell Core as well as major versions. So we're up to version 6 and now 7, and just the other day version 7.1 was actually released. And so the question came up, if I have a dependency on a specific version of PowerShell, then how do I make sure that I can continue to run that version of PowerShell if I update my developer system with the latest version of PowerShell? And so what we can do is, instead of having to kind of worry about conflicting versions, like going from version 6 to version 7 to version 7.1, what we can actually do is isolate these processes, these PowerShell processes, using containers or Docker containers. So in the rest of this video, what we're going to do is take a look at how you can get Docker up and running on your system. I'm going to be using Windows 10 here, for example, but feel free to follow along if you're using Linux or macOS, because as we all know, PowerShell is cross-platform, much like other runtimes like Node.js or Python or Java or .NET for that matter, which PowerShell actually sits on top of .NET, which is part of why we can run cross-platform here. So let's jump over here into my Windows 10 desktop here, where right now I just have PowerShell running in the Windows Terminal, the preview version of Windows Terminal, which has some nice handy features like the command palette, which maybe I'm not using the PowerShell or preview. Yeah, I am using the preview version. Why is my, oh, there we go. Control-Shift-P. I guess I didn't have the window active, but it's got a nice command palette built in, similar to Visual Studio Code, kind of, not quite as advanced. Yeah, if you're on the Windows platform, you should definitely be using the Windows Terminal, as it provides a lot of nice features like this nice acrylic effect where it's kind of semi-transparent or semi-opaque depending on your preference. And I've also got a custom color theme applied as well. So Windows Terminal is definitely really nice. But what I want to do for now is just fire up Firefox and head over to, well, first of all, since Scoop is here, I might as well mention I do use Scoop very heavily to install software on my developer workstation and keep software up to date. So things like Visual Studio Code, PowerShell Core, FFmpeg, Vim even. There's a whole bunch of different software packages that I can easily install using the Scoop package manager. So as far as getting PowerShell up to date on my dev system, definitely use Scoop. However, if you want to run multiple versions of PowerShell side by side, that is definitely where Docker comes into play. So if you head over to Google and just search for Docker Desktop, so this is really the easiest way to get Docker containers up and running on your system. And so basically, it only runs on Mac and Windows, and that's because Docker runs natively on Linux. So if you're running like Ubuntu Linux or Arch Linux or something on your desktop system, then you could just install Docker directly without needing to use this Docker Desktop tool. Now, what Docker Desktop does, if you're on Mac or Windows, is it actually spins up a virtual machine behind the scenes. So if you're on macOS, it uses the Xhive hypervisor. And if you're on the Windows 10 platform, it actually uses Hyper-V to spin up a Linux virtual machine. Now, it spins up that Linux virtual machine, but you don't have to worry about firing up Hyper-V or knowing how to use Xhive on Mac in order to access that VM. What it actually does is it gives you access to the Docker CLI running directly on Windows. However, that Docker CLI is pre-configured to connect to the Docker daemon, or the service, that is running on that Linux VM. So you don't really have to do anything special except install Docker Desktop, and Docker is ready to use. You can start running Docker commands. So make sure that you start by downloading that. I do run the Edge version of it just to make sure I'm staying up to date with the latest bug fixes and the latest feature sets and things like that. But there is a stable version as well. It's about 500 or 600 megabytes or so to download. Updates come out on a fairly regular basis, especially if you're on the Edge channel. And so just keep in mind that the download can be kind of big depending on how fast your internet connection is. So now that we've got Docker installed and set up, we've got the Docker CLI, we can run that locally here. But now what we want to do is actually run PowerShell inside of this isolated container where it's got its own file system and everything, and it doesn't have to worry about conflicting with other PowerShell versions. In this case, we're not actually going to have to worry about installing PowerShell. What we're actually going to do is just run a Docker container on that Linux VM that is running a specific version of PowerShell. So how do we do that? Well, if you head over to hub.docker.com, this is basically a big repository containing all of the different Docker container images. So I mean, there's Docker containers for things like Python, there's like Ubuntu-based containers that you can build off of, there's Alpine Linux, which is like a really tiny Linux distribution, and all sorts of different kind of base images that you can build off of. Well, thankfully, Microsoft has provided PowerShell as a pre-built container image. And so what we can do is just open up the PowerShell repository here and look at all of the different tags that are available for it. So if we scroll down here, you'll see that we have Windows images. So there is actually the ability to run Windows containers, but what we're doing is actually going to be running Linux containers instead. So what we want to do is look for Linux images. And if you take a look at the create time over here, you can see that some of these have been built and published just within the last day or so. So we've got version 7.1 RC2. We've got these Ubuntu base images. We've got CentOS base images. So there are actually a ton of different images that you can actually run PowerShell core from. Now, what I'm looking for specifically is the release version of PowerShell 7.1. I don't want the release candidate, I want the actual release version. And so what I think I'm going to do here is probably grab this Alpine one. And the reason I want to grab the Alpine one is because Alpine Linux is a very lightweight Linux distribution. And so the container image itself is very small and it doesn't have a lot of kind of bloat to it. So it's a really good one for demonstration. But you could use really probably any of these other ones that are built on like Ubuntu Bionic, which is 1804. I'm not sure why they have two different tags. I think that's actually the same image, but this one's actually for an ARM CPU, so we probably wouldn't want that one. There is probably an Ubuntu one down here somewhere. Yeah, here's a Xenial. Here's Bionic for 7.1. But yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and stick with the Alpine for now. So basically what we'll do is we'll do docker pull Microsoft/PowerShell. So this is basically the name of this repository. So if you look at hub.docker.com, it's the Microsoft PowerShell image. And so what we're going to do is pull PowerShell and then paste in that tag, which is Alpine-3.1. And of course, it's going to tell me it doesn't recognize that. So apparently they don't actually publish it to the Docker Hub anymore. So over here, you'll see that there's this copy command where you can download container images from a Microsoft registry. And so what we'll do is do that and then specify the tag alpine-3.10. All right, so that's working. So basically, Microsoft is no longer publishing directly to the Docker Hub. They're publishing to their own separate repository for Docker container images. All right, so now we've downloaded this container image for PowerShell version 7.1. So what we'll do now is, now that we've downloaded the image, it's kind of like an operating system image, but it's actually just a container image, right? It's just got its own file system. And so what we're going to do is actually run a container on that Docker Desktop Linux VM. So what we'll do is do, whoops, capital letters there. So if I do docker run, and then I'll just tack on the --rm parameter, so that it deletes after we're done with it. And then I'll do -it. Sorry for the font color, it's a little bit dark there, but I'm just doing -it. And then I am going to specify the full container image name. So I'm basically just going to copy this here, and then put a space, and then run it. And so when we spin up that container, you can see that we now have PowerShell version 7.1 running. So I can do something like start sleep 1. Okay, that works really well. I can do get command, I can do get module, I can do get module -list available, I can do something like find module, maybe AZ, I think is the Azure module. And so basically, this is a fully fledged working PowerShell 7.1 release version, not the release candidate, but the actual production release version. And it's basically running anything that I want it to. So if I wanted to, I could actually just write a script, put it inside this container, and run it. And it doesn't really matter what version of PowerShell is installed on my host system, because I am running this PowerShell version inside of an isolated Docker container. So now, if I wanted to, let's say, run a different version, what I'm going to do now is basically detach from the container. So I'm going to leave it running, but I'm going to detach from it so it's running in the background. What I can do is hit Control-P, Q, and then what that's going to do is it's going to detach from the container and return me back to my terminal session. So if I do docker ps, that's going to list out the running containers. And as you can see, this PowerShell image that's built on top of Alpine Linux is still there running in the background. And if I wanted to, I could just do docker attach B2A. So basically just grab part of the container ID here. You don't have to specify the full container ID, but I can do docker attach to that container. So now I'm back inside of the container, so I'll hit Control-P, Control-Q, and that's going to bring me back again to my host session. So now, let's say you wanted to run a, let's say, PowerShell version 6.1.2 or something like that. Well, what you can do is if you scroll down here in the Docker Hub, so I'm still on hub.docker.com, under the PowerShell repository, if you scroll all the way down past the Windows images and past the Linux images, there is a link right here that says you can retrieve a list of all available tags for PowerShell at this URL here. So if you go ahead and just middle-click that URL and open up a new tab here, you will see a massive, massive, massive JSON array returned containing all of the different supported container image tags for PowerShell. So basically, I could go all the way back to version 6.0.2 running on top of a CentOS image, or I could do 6.0.2 running on top of Ubuntu 16 image. There's a whole ton of different options here. So 6.0.4, those are Windows images right here, so I couldn't run those on my Linux VM. There's Ubuntu Xenial images. There's Nano Server images, again, if you're on Windows. Here's 6.1.0 RC1 for Windows, and as well as all the Linux images as well. So there's basically literally every single possible version of PowerShell that you could possibly want to run sitting out here inside of this PowerShell repository, as long as you specify the correct tag for the image that you want to run. So let's say that I go back and want to run version 6.1.0. So what we'll do is just search here for 6.1.0, and maybe I want to run it on Ubuntu. So I'm just going to scroll down here a little bit. I don't want the preview versions. I don't want the RC versions. However, right here, we've got 6.1.0 running on Ubuntu Bionic Beaver. So what I'll do is just grab that and do a Control-R to search for my Docker pull command in my history. And what I'll do is I'll go back to mcr.microsoft.com/PowerShell. That's the repository, the image repository that we're pointing to. However, I'm going to replace that tag at the very end of it here, the Alpine-3.1.0, with the new tag of the container that we want to run, which is 6.1.0 Ubuntu Bionic. So that's going to take a moment to download here as well. All right, so now we've downloaded this other container image for PowerShell version 6.1.0 on top of Ubuntu Bionic. So what we're going to do is basically just hit up arrow, change the Docker pull to Docker run, and then we'll tack on the -it as well as the --rm just to make sure that this container cleans up itself after it's stopped. And that's pretty much all we have to do. So now we are on an interactive container running PowerShell version 6.1.0. But if I hit Control-PQ to detach from the container, but again, leaving it running, I can do Docker PS, and check this out. I now have two different containers running completely different versions of PowerShell. One of them is running 6.1.0. One of them is running version 7 on top of Alpine Linux, even though the tag doesn't explicitly say version 7 of PowerShell. It is actually version 7 of PowerShell. It's just the latest version of PowerShell running on top of Alpine Linux. So that's pretty much all you have to do is specify the tag of the version that you want to run inside of a container. Docker will go ahead and download that container image locally and cache it on your Docker VM and run it. And so there are versions all the way from 6.0.2 all the way up to 7.1, including all of the preview versions, including all of the release candidates. So if you're building like a PowerShell module or some kind of PowerShell application, and you need to make sure that it runs on every single version of PowerShell, including the preview releases of it, then you can actually use Docker to do that very efficiently. Now, if you have a script that you would like to actually run inside of a container, you would actually need to build a custom Docker container image for that. So let's say that I had a script here. Let me just do a makedir workdir, for example, and then I'll cd into workdir. So I have nothing in there. But now what I need to do is let's say I have a script. So I'll use Vim here, create a script called scripts.ps1, and inside of the script, I'll just do write host, and then get date, something like that. So get date, and then we'll just test out that script really quick here locally. Okay, sure enough, it's just going to work just fine there. So now I want to get this script inside of one of those containers that I can actually execute the script on a specific version of PowerShell in a container. So this is actually a really easy thing to do. All you have to do is create a Docker file that is based on one of the container images that we just took a look at. So what we'll do is do vim dockerfile, and then the from instruction allows you to start with a Docker base image and then build on top of it. So you can copy files inside of the container, you can install software inside of the container, you can basically do whatever you need to do to prepare your own custom container image for production use. So what we'll do is we'll say from mcr.microsoft.com/PowerShell Alpine 3-3.10. Now we want to use an instruction called add. And what add is going to do is it's going to take a file from the local directory and it's going to copy it into the container's file system. So I'm just going to create a directory called /data, and that's where we're going to place our script file. And then after that, I think that's pretty much all we have to do at this point. We could set a custom entry point, but I'm just going to skip over that for now because it's not strictly necessary. So now what we need to do is do a docker build command. And so docker build will take our local context directory, our workdir, and it will basically build the custom container image using the instructions that are inside the Docker file. What I'll do is do docker build --tag. Again, sorry for the bad font color here. And I'll just call this pwsh test. And then we need to specify dot, which is the current directory, and that's the build context for the Docker file. So it's basically going to copy that script into there. So now that we've done this, we can actually run a container using our custom container image called posh test. So let's do docker run --rm -it pwsh test. That's our custom image. So now, as we expect, we get our Alpine-based PowerShell 7.1.0. And right now, I am in the root directory. However, we copied our script.ps1 into the /data directory. So if we cd into /data, it looks like it's not there. Why is that? Well, that's because I think if I cat the script, yeah, so what I did is I actually copied the script in as the file named data. What I actually meant to do was to copy it into a directory. Let's do /data/, and then we'll just rebuild it here. And then we will run a new container. So now when I do ls, data is actually a directory. So let me cd into data there. And now I've got script.ps1. And if I do /script.ps1, sure enough, it runs that PowerShell script. So I've basically taken that script from my local file system, I put it inside of my custom container image, and now I can just run that container and I can access that script that was copied inside of it. Well, I hope this has been an informative video for you guys. Being able to run different versions of different runtimes or different module versions inside of different containers is a really powerful capability that allows you to thoroughly test your software on different versions, and it allows you to avoid having to forcibly migrate software from old versions to newer versions of a runtime, because you can continue to run the old version of the runtime until you are ready to actually perform that upgrade work. Again, check me out at twitter.com/PCGeek86 or over on the web at trevorsullivan.net. Catch you next time.